What's up, guys? In this video, we're going to be diving into the thin wrapper API functions for processing any data within the maci library. And I want to note that this functionality will allow you to process either .ini or .ini files, .conf files, or .conf files, and .cfg files. They all share similarities in their syntax, even though they're not exactly the same, but you should at least be able to generally load them and process them for your project needs. Now, to give credit where credit is due, the thin API functions used for the maci library that enable the ini functionality utilize and wrap the native config parser library shipped with the Python standard library for its underlying functionality. If you want more information on the config parser library, I definitely recommend looking up the Python standard library official documentation to learn more about it. In fact, I'm going to refer to looking up the information on that in this video because handling the data is utilizing a more unique custom data type object that the developers called config parser. Okay, with that said, let's start off with learning how to just load our data. So I already have some sample data using the same data examples that we've been using through the whole series. And as you can see, we have our section 1, section 2. It's using the same exact names and values, but they are separated into separate sections. Now you probably noticed this is named with .conf, even though the library is called ini or ini. It doesn't really matter what you change it to. I'll go ahead and change it to .ini just to keep it consistent. But you still get the same syntax highlighting. You can also change it to .cfg. It really depends on what you want. Either way, you're going to be able to load the data and process it as you would expect. Now, I'm not saying all of those extensions use the same language because they do have some slight differences, but they do generally use the same syntax, so you should be safe to loading it. If you're unsure, again, I would definitely look up the Python official documentation on config parser to understand it further. Okay, so let's close this and see how to load it. We'll go ahead and create a file name variable like we've been doing, and we'll just call it mygame.ini. We'll change that to a y. And then we'll go ahead and create a variable called ini-data. And then we'll go ahead and write maci dot, and then as soon as I type ini, you should see all the available ini functions to process your ini data. And I might use that word interchangeably, ini or ini, but hopefully it makes sense. So let's go to load, and then we'll pass in our file name variable, and that should be it. If we hover over this, all it requires is one argument, either a string or a path object. If you're not sure what a path object is, definitely look it up on the Python official documentation under pathlib. And I pass it in, and then let me go ahead and grab the print function here and print out and see what it shows. So let's go ahead and run this. And so now when I run this, you see that it returns a config parser object. Again, if you're not familiar with a config parser object, I would definitely look it up on Python's official documentation. However, the maci documentation does talk about it a little bit and how to use it and even how to load some data into it. I will show you the simplest way to access your data, which feels more native to Python. So if you do hover over this, so if we actually grab the file and drag it over, just so we have a reference here, we see username, starting score, money is alive. Let me go and access that. So the easiest way to access the names and values is you first must access the section, and then you can access the name to access the value. And the simplest way to do this within Python is just to use some square brackets and call your names and values like a dictionary. So if I type in section 1, if you run it like this, it's just going to return this section. However, if I go ahead and add the other brackets, and let's just say username, and run this, it's going to return the actual value that I'm looking for. But that's how easy it is to access your sections and values within the config parser object. Now, something to note, any value within a config parser object is going to always be a string. This has to do with the way the config parser object is designed. If I try to, let's say, load money, which to us looks like a floating point value. If I run this and print it, we do get the value, but the data type is actually a string. So if we run our type function over this and run it, you're going to see that it's of class string. So that's something to keep in mind when loading ini files, CFG, or comp files. It doesn't really matter. All the values is going to be a string. Of course, if you want to convert it back to its original data type, you need to implement some logic in order to do so. I'm not going to show you that, but that's just something I wanted to make you aware of if you didn't know. But that's it. That's simply how you load your data in. And if we hover over the ini-load function, the only other option is the encoding. And as I've mentioned throughout the series, I'm not going to dive into that. If you know what it is, then you know how to operate it. If not, I would definitely look into it. So there isn't any load string functions or even dump string functions for this part of the library at this time. So the next thing I'd like to show you would be how to write your data to a file. But before I do that, I actually want to talk about how to build your data, and then we'll go ahead and talk about writing your data to a file. So the first function I want to talk about in building your data is ini-build-auto. Maci comes shipped with a useful function that automatically builds out your data for you. And it's actually extremely useful, so you don't have to deal with the config parser object too much. And you can just use a plain old dictionary. So if we type out maci.ini-build, you'll see there's two options, and we'll go over the manual one after. And we go to the ini-build-auto and hover over it. You see, all it accepts is a dictionary, but it has a specific structure that you need to fill in order to make it work. And if you look at the documentation here, it actually gives you an idea. But of course, you can also go to the Maci Docs website, and it actually talks about this a little bit more specifically as well. So ini-build-auto, before we actually use it, and it does return a config parser object, we're going to go ahead and build out our data using a dictionary. So I'm just going to go dict data. Create a dictionary, and always, to use this function, our top level keys must be our section names first, and then our sub-level values will be a dictionary with our key name and our value pairs. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-write it out. So here's our set of data. As you can see, the first key name in our dictionary is going to be our section names, right? And then the values is actually going to be the name itself, and then the corresponding value that it's supposed to point to. But that's it. As long as you follow this structure, it should write to a file real easily. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the dump function, and we'll talk about both at the same time, and then we'll talk about building the data manually. So let me go and insert my dictionary data here, and then we'll create a new variable called ini-data, and then we'll go ahead and grab our dump function. And we'll pass in our file name. We'll need to uncomment this. And let's actually create a new file called mygame2 and pass in our ini-data. Let's go ahead and run this. You see that ran just fine. Here's our new file. I'm going to drag it over here so we can see it. And there's our data. So you see what I mean? The very top level key names are going to represent your actual section names, right? And then beneath that, you're going to have your key name and your value pairs for all of your data. So hopefully that makes sense and is pretty straightforward to understand. But this ini-build-auto function can be extremely useful to automatically build out your data, so you don't have to do it manually using the config parser object. Now, while we're here, let's go ahead and check out the dump function a little bit more closely and get a better understanding. So we hover over it. As per typical structure throughout the Maci series, whenever you're writing to a file, you're going to always start with your file name, which accepts a string or a path object. Again, if you don't know what a path object is, please look up the pathlib library from Python's standard library documentation. But we just passed a string, and then after that, we need to pass a config parser object, which was returned to us by the ini-build-auto after it parsed through our dictionary data. And then here we have some other typical options like append and encoding. I'm not going to go over encoding, but append allows us to append to the file. So if we go ahead and enable that option, pretty straightforward. This should allow us to append our data to the file, as you can see here. Now this would actually cause a problem if you had duplicate section names when trying to load it in, but just for example purposes, I just wanted to show you that you can append data, especially if you have a new set of data or a new set of sections, and you can easily just append to it as such, and it'll load in just fine, as long as the section names are unique. But that's pretty much it for the ini-dump function. There's really nothing left to talk about on it. So the last thing we'll go ahead and jump into is the ini-build manual. So the ini-build manual function, all it really does is return to you an empty config parser object, which allows you to go ahead and build out your data using the true config parser object that comes from the Python standard library, which is the config parser library. So obviously you can go ahead and import the config parser library if you want to, but Maci gives you thin access or alternative access to retrieve that object, but it is the one and true same object. we'll go ahead and create a variable and just go maci.ini build manual. And there's no parameter options in here. As you can see, all it does is return an empty config parser object for you to build out your data. So how do you build out your config parser object data? If you were to check into the options here, there's a lot of different methods and attributes that you could access to do different things within a config parser object, but I'm not going to go over it in this video at all. Please look up the documentation or watch some videos on it to understand it deeper. But Maci's documentation does talk about it lightly, and the easiest way to do it is again to treat it like a dictionary. So you can first start out with your section name. So I'm just going to call it my section, and then I'm going to assign it to my name. We'll just call it like new data, and then its value, and we'll just say data. Totally fine. So this is how you can easily build out your data manually. And then if we take our dump function, let's say maci.dump or ini-dump, and we take in our file name, and then we take in our new ini data, and now we're just going to use the same file name and overwrite it. So as soon as I run this, see it overwrote that file and created our new section name with our new data. All right, so that's going to go ahead and wrap up this video on how to use the thin ini or ini functions within the Maci library in order to process your .ini or .conf or .cfg files. Thank you for watching. Take care.